It was a quiet afternoon in a small, unassuming neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and life moves at a slower pace. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets as birds chirped in the distance. But this peaceful scene was about to be shattered by an event that would leave the entire community, and eventually, the world, stunned. On this day, an elderly black man named Mr. Elijah Thompson, a respected figure in the community known for his gentle demeanor and wise words, found himself at the center of a confrontation that would change everything. What started as a routine errand to the local grocery store quickly spiraled into a nightmare when two police officers approached him, their badges gleaming under the sunlight, their expressions hard and unyielding. Mr. Thompson, a man in his late 70s with a slight limp from an old injury, was simply standing on the sidewalk, waiting for his ride. He had no idea why the officers were there, or why they seemed so intent on questioning him. But as they began to speak, their tone was sharp, accusatory, and laced with an aggression that made no sense. They demanded to know what he was doing there, why he was loitering, and if he had any identification. Mr. Thompson, confused but cooperative, reached for his wallet. But before he could even explain himself, one of the officers grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The pain shot through his body, and he cried out, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Passers-by stopped in their tracks, watching in horror as the scene unfolded. Some pulled out their phones, recording the encounter, while others whispered among themselves, unsure of what to do. What the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Mr. Thompson was no ordinary man. He had lived a life of quiet dignity, but he also had connections, people who respected him and would stop at nothing to ensure justice was served. As the officers continued to manhandle him, Mr. Thompson's mind raced. He knew he had to act quickly. With a calmness that defied the chaos around him, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady as he dialed a number. The officers laughed, thinking it was a futile gesture. "Who you gonna call, old man?" one of them sneered. But Mr. Thompson ignored them, his focus entirely on the voice that answered on the other end of the line. The person on the phone listened intently as Mr. Thompson explained the situation in a few short, urgent sentences. There was a pause, and then the voice on the other end said something that made Mr. Thompson's eyes narrow with determination. He hung up and looked at the officers, his expression unreadable. "You boys are in for a world of trouble," he said quietly. The officers scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in their eyes. They had no idea who Mr. Thompson had just called, but something about his calm confidence sent a chill down their spines. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. But these weren't the usual police sirens. They were different, more urgent. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up, and out stepped a man in a sharp suit, his face stern and his presence commanding. The officers froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. The man walked straight to Mr. Thompson, who was still being held by the officers, and said something that made their faces turn pale. "Let him go. Now." The authority in his voice was undeniable, and the officers immediately released Mr. Thompson, stepping back as if they'd been burned. But this was only the beginning. The man in the suit wasn't alone. Behind him, a team of investigators emerged, their badges glinting in the sunlight. They began questioning the officers, their tone cold and professional. It was clear that this wasn't just about Mr. Thompson anymore. It was about something much bigger. The officers stammered, trying to explain themselves, but their words fell flat. The crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence, sensing that something monumental was about to happen. As the investigators continued their work, Mr. Thompson stood tall, his dignity intact despite the ordeal he had just endured. He looked at the officers, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "You thought you could push me around. he said softly. But you picked the wrong man. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their confidence crumbling by the second. They had no idea what was coming next, but they knew one thing for sure. Their careers, and possibly their lives, were about to change forever. And as the scene unfolded, one question hung in the air, unanswered. Who was Mr. Elijah Thompson really? And what kind of power did he wield that could bring an entire police department to its knees? The answers would come, but not before more secrets were revealed. More lives were upended and more truths came to light. This was just the beginning of a story that would shake the foundations of justice and power, leaving everyone wondering who the real victims were and who would have the last word. But for now, the tension was palpable, the stakes higher than are ever. The officers stood there, their futures hanging by a thread, while Mr. Thompson watched, his expression unreadable. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the next move. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in shadows, one thing was clear. This was far from over. The man in the suit, whose name was Agent Marcus Reed, didn't say much as he escorted Mr. Thompson to the black SUV. His presence alone was enough to command respect, and the officers who had moments ego been so bold now looked like they wanted to disappear. Mr. Thompson, though shaken, walked with a quiet dignity, his head held high. He didn't look back at the officers, but the weight of his silence spoke volumes. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, their whispers growing louder as they tried to piece together what was happening. Who was this elderly man who could summon such authority with a single phone call? And why did it feel like the ground was shifting beneath their feet? As the SUV pulled away, Mr. Thompson sat in the back seat, his hands resting on his knees. He stared out the window, his mind racing. He hadn't wanted it to come to this. For years, he had lived a simple life, far removed from the world of power and influence he once knew. But today, that world had come crashing back into his life, and he knew there was no turning back. Agent Reed glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "You did the right thing, sir," he said finally, breaking the silence. Mr. Thompson nodded, but said nothing. He wasn't sure if he had done the right thing, only that he had done what he had to do. Meanwhile, back at the scene, the investigators were busy collecting evidence. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed the footage from bystanders' phones, and took statements from the shaken onlookers. The two officers, whose names were revealed to be Officer Daniels and Officer Harris, were separated and questioned individually. Their stories didn't add up. Daniels claimed they had received a call about a suspicious person in the area, but there was no record of such a call. Harris, on the other hand, insisted they were just doing their job, but his voice wavered as he spoke. It was clear they were hiding something. But what? As the investigation deepened, more details began to emerge. Officer Daniels had a history of complaints against him, though none had ever stuck. Harris, relatively new to the force, had been his partner for less than a year. Together, they had developed a reputation for being overly aggressive, particularly in neighborhoods like this one. But this time, they had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. The footage from the bystanders' phones was damning. It showed Mr. Thompson, a frail elderly man, being manhandled for no apparent reason. His calm demeanor and the officers' aggressive behavior were starkly contrasted, and it was clear who the real victim was. But the question on everyone's mind was, who was Mr. Elijah Thompson? To the people in the neighborhood, he was just a kind old man who always had a smile and a story to share. He was the kind of person who would help you carry your groceries or fix a leaky faucet without asking for anything in return. But there was always something about him that seemed different. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, as if he had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine. And now, it seemed, those things were coming back to light. As the news of the Yao incident spread, so did the rumors. Some said Mr. Thompson was a retired judge. Others claimed he had once been a high-ranking military officer. A few even whispered that he had connections to powerful politicians. But no one knew for sure. What they did know was that the man who had always been so humble and unassuming had a side to him that no one had ever seen before. And that side was now front and center, demanding answers and accountability. Back at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. The chief of police, a man named Harold Greaves, was pacing his office, his face flushed with anger. He had been blindsided by the incident and was now scrambling to contain the fallout. He had already received calls from city officials, demanding answers. The media was camped outside the station, and social media was ablaze with outrage. This was a PR nightmare, and Greaves knew it. But more than that, he knew there was something deeper going on, something he didn't understand. When Agent Reed arrived at the station with Mr. Thompson, Greaves was waiting. He greeted them with a forced smile, trying to mask his unease. "Mr. Thompson, I can't tell you how sorry I am about what happened," he began, but Agent Reed cut him off. "Save it, Chief," he said coldly. "This isn't about apologies. This is about accountability." Greaves swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had dealt with federal agents before, but there was something about Reed that made him nervous. The man exuded authority, and it was clear he wasn't here to play games. As the hours passed, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It turned out that Mr. Thompson had indeed been a judge. A federal judge, to be exact. He had retired years ago, but his influence had never waned. He had spent his career fighting for justice, often taking on cases that others wouldn't touch. He had made enemies, but he had also earned the respect of some of the most powerful people in the country. And now, those people were stepping in to ensure that justice was served once again. But this wasn't just about Mr. Thompson. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the incident was part of a larger pattern of misconduct within the police department. Complaints that had been buried were now being unearthed, and the list of officers involved was growing. It seemed that Daniels and Harris were just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they found, and it was becoming clear that this was a systemic issue. As night fell, the tension in the air was palpable. The officers involved were suspended pending further investigation, and the department was in chaos. The community, meanwhile, was divided. Some were relieved that justice was finally being served, while others were wary, unsure of what this meant for the future. And through it all, Mr. Thompson remained a quiet but powerful presence. He didn't seek the spotlight, but he couldn't escape it. His calm demeanor and unwavering resolve had made him a symbol of hope for some and a target for others. But the story was far from over. As the investigators continued their work, they uncovered something that sent shockwaves through the department. It seemed that the incident with Mr. Thompson was just the beginning. There were darker secrets lurking beneath the surface. Secrets that implicated not just a few rogue officers, but people in positions of power. And as the truth began to emerge, it became clear that this was about more than just one man's fight for justice. It was about a system that had failed its people, and the lengths some would go to protect it. As the night wore on, Mr. Thompson sat in a small room at the station, sipping a cup of tea. He was tired, but he knew he couldn't rest yet. There was still so much to do, so many questions that needed answers. Agent Reed sat across from him, his expression grim. "This is bigger than we thought," he said quietly. Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes distant. "It always is," he replied. And as the two men sat in silence, the weight of what was to come hung heavy in the air. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. But one thing was certain: Mr. Elijah Thompson wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, the small town woke up to a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. News vans lined the streets outside the police station, reporters clamoring for updates on the unfolding scandal. Social media was flooded with hashtags and posts, some demanding justice for Mr. Thompson, others defending the officers, and still others speculating wildly about what was really going on. The town, once a quiet backdrop to everyday life, had become the center of a national conversation about police accountability, systemic racism, and the abuse of power. And at the heart of it all was Mr. Elijah Thompson, the unassuming elderly man who had somehow become the face of a movement. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was even more charged. Officer Daniels and Harris had been placed on administrative leave, but they weren't the only ones under scrutiny. As the investigation expanded, more officers were called in for questioning. Some were cooperative, others defiant, but all of them seemed to share a common thread: fear. Fear of what might come out. Fear of losing their jobs. Fear of facing consequences for actions they had long thought were buried. Chief Greaves, meanwhile, was doing everything he could to maintain control. But it was slipping through his fingers. He had spent years building a reputation as a tough but fair leader. But now that reputation was crumbling. And he knew that, if the truth came out, it wouldn't just be his career on the line, it would be his freedom. While the police department was in turmoil, the community was grappling with its own emotions. At the local diner, where Mr. Thompson was a regular, the breakfast crowd was abuzz with conversation. Some people couldn't believe what had happened, while others weren't surprised at all. "I've lived here my whole life," one man said, shaking his head. "I always knew there was something off about those guys, but nobody ever listened." A woman at the next table nodded in agreement. "It's not just them," she said quietly. "It's the whole system. This town, this country, it's broken." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For many, the incident with Mr. Thompson was a wake-up call, a reminder that the problems they had ignored for too long couldn't be ignored anymore. Meanwhile, Agent Reed and his team were working around the clock, piecing together the evidence. They had uncovered a pattern of misconduct that went back years, involving not just the police department but also local officials and even some business owners. It seemed that the town had been operating under a veil of corruption, with certain people pulling the strings behind the scenes, and Mr. Thompson, it turned out, had been quietly gathering information on them for years. He had never intended to use it, but when he was pushed too far, he had no choice. Now, that information was in the hands of the investigators. And it was explosive, but not everyone was happy about the investigation. In a dimly lit office on the outskirts of town, a group of men sat around a table, their faces grim. These were the people who had benefited from the status quo, the ones who had everything to lose if the truth came out. They had spent years building their power, and they weren't about to let it slip away. "We need to shut this down," one of them said, his voice low and dangerous, "before it's too late." The others nodded in agreement, but none of them had a clear plan. They knew they were dealing with forces far beyond their control, and it terrified them. Back at the station, Mr. Thompson was preparing to give a statement. He had avoided the media so far, but he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. As he sat in front of the cameras, the room fell silent. He looked out at the sea of faces, his expression calm but resolute. "I never wanted this," he began, his voice steady. "I just wanted to live my life in peace. But what happened to me isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of world we want to live in, and the kind of people we want to be." His words resonated deeply, not just with the people in the room, but with everyone watching at home. This wasn't just a story about one man. It was a story about justice, about accountability, about the power of standing up for what's right. But even as Mr. Thompson spoke, danger was closing in. The men in the dimly lit office had made their move, and it was more ruthless than anyone could have anticipated. A key witness in the investigation had gone missing, and the evidence they had been counting on was suddenly in jeopardy. Agent Reed received the news with a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew what it meant. The people they were up against were willing to do whatever it took to protect themselves, and they were just getting started. As the day wore on, the tension continued to build. The investigation was at a critical point, and every move mattered. The community was on edge, unsure of what would happen next, and through it all, Mr. Thompson remained a steady presence, a reminder of why this fight was so important. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The stakes were higher than ever, and the lines between right and wrong were becoming increasingly blurred. As night fell, the town was enveloped in an uneasy silence. The storm that had been brewing for years was finally here, and no one knew how it would end. But one thing was certain. The fight for justice was far from over. And as long as Mr. Elijah Thompson was standing, that fight would continue. The question was, who would be left standing when the dust finally settled? The town was holding its breath. Every passing hour brought new developments, each more shocking than the last. The missing witness, a former police dispatcher named Linda Carter, had been one of the key pieces in the investigation. She had access to records, recordings, and information that could expose the full extent of the corruption. Her disappearance sent ripples of fear through the community. Was she hiding, or had something far worse happened? Agent Reed and his team worked tirelessly, following every lead, but the clock was ticking. Without Linda, the case could fall apart, and the people responsible might never face justice. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson found himself at the center of a storm he had never asked for, but couldn't walk away from. He had become a symbol, not just for the town, but for people everywhere who had been wronged by those in power. His quiet strength and unwavering resolve inspired others to come forward with their own stories. A young mother shared how her son had been unfairly targeted by the same officers who had harassed Mr. Thompson. A local business owner revealed how he had been pressured to pay bribes to keep his shop open. The more people spoke up, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a system that had failed its people, time and time again. But as the voices of the community grew louder, so did the resistance from those who had everything to lose. The men in the dimly lit office had gone silent, but their presence was felt everywhere. Anonymous threats began to circulate, targeting those who dared to speak out. A local journalist who had been covering the story found her car vandalized. A community organizer received a chilling phone call in the middle of the night. Even Mr. Thompson's home was no longer safe. One evening, as he sat in his living room, a brick came crashing through his window, shattering the glass and sending shards across the floor. Attached to the brick was a note with a single word: "Stop." Agent Reed immediately increased security around Mr. Thompson, but the old man refused to be intimidated. "They can try to scare me," he said calmly, "but they won't succeed. I've lived too long to let fear dictate my actions." His courage only deepened the respect people had for him, but it also made him a target. Reed knew they were running out of time. The longer this dragged on, the more dangerous it would become. And then, a breakthrough. A tip came in from an unlikely source. A teenager who had been skateboarding near the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. He had seen a car matching the description of Linda Carter's vehicle parked behind the building late at night. Reed and his team moved quickly, descending on the warehouse with a sense of urgency. What they found inside was both a relief and a nightmare. Linda was alive, but barely. She had been beaten and left tied up in a dark corner of the building. Her voice trembled as she recounted what had happened. "They wanted me to stay quiet," she whispered. "But I couldn't. Not after what I've seen." Linda's testimony was the turning point. She had names, dates, and recordings. Everything they needed to bring the corruption to light. But as the team worked to secure the evidence, they realized they weren't alone. Shadows moved outside the warehouse, and the sound of approaching vehicles sent a chill through the air. Reed's radio crackled to life with a warning from one of his agents. "We've got company, and they're not here to talk." Back in town, Mr. Thompson was preparing for a community meeting. He had called for a gathering at the local church, a place where people could come together to share their fears, their hopes, and their determination to see this through. The church was packed, every seat filled, with more people standing in the aisles. As Mr. Thompson stood at the podium, the room fell silent. "We've come a long way," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But the hardest part is still ahead of us. They're going to try to divide us, to scare us, to make us give up. But we can't let them. Not now. Not ever." As he spoke, a commotion broke out at the back of the church. A group of men, their faces hidden by hoods, had burst in, shouting and waving weapons. Panic spread through the crowd as people scrambled for safety. Mr. Thompson stood his ground, his eyes locked on the intruders. "This is what they do," he said, his voice rising above the chaos. "They try to silence us, but we are stronger than they are. Together, we are stronger." The standoff was tense, the air thick with fear and defiance. But before the situation could escalate further, the sound of sirens filled the air. Agent Reed and his team had arrived, along with reinforcements. The intruders, realizing they were outnumbered, fled into the night. But the message was clear. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. As the crowd slowly calmed down, Mr. Thompson looked out at the faces around him. He saw fear, yes, but also determination. They were ready to stand together, to fight for what was right. And so was he. But even as he felt a glimmer of hope, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The people they were up against were desperate, and desperate people were capable of anything. The night ended with a sense of uneasy calm. The community had come together, but the battle was far from won. Agent Reed and his team were closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but the forces working against them were growing more dangerous by the minute. And as Mr. Thompson returned to his home, now under heavy guard, he knew that the next few days would determine everything. The climax was coming, and with it, the moment of truth. But for now, all they could do was wait and prepare for the storm that was about to break.